there's a lot of other nutrients in the forage that we also need to check, namely some of the minerals. So we, especially things like copper and zinc, which sometimes, and at least in this part of the country and what I've seen in the Northeast, is typically our copper and zinc is a little low or even borderline deficient, if not more deficient, if you're also trying to exercise these animals on the all-forage diet. So particularly if you're using this as a majority of your horse's diet, it's a really good idea and such a huge investment to get a forage sample and get it tested.
Welcome to another special equine edition of the Pet Food Science Podcast, where we explore science, the science behind how we feed our horses. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Rankovich, and today we're joined by Dr. Carey Williams to tackle some of the most frequently asked questions in equine nutrition before diving into some of the research that she's done looking at oxidative stress and vitamin E in performance horses. Welcome, Dr. Williams. It's so wonderful to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be joining you today.
That's great. I'm excited to talk to you. Before we sort of dive in, Dr. Williams is a professor and equine extension specialist at Rutgers University, where she focuses on equine nutrition, exercise physiology, and pasture management. She earned her Ph.D. in animal science from Virginia Tech and has since made significant contributions to equine research, education, and outreach. She was widely recognized for her work, receiving awards like the American Feed Industry Association Award for Equine Nutrition. Beyond research, Dr. Williams is passionate about education, bringing scientific findings to horse owners, trainers, and industry professionals. And when she's not busy doing all of her science and research and all the wonderful stuff that she does, she's training her 7-year-old sport horse, Palmer, for dressage and eventing. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So to start, before we dive into some questions and dive into your research, would you mind providing a little bit more background about yourself and what led you to focus on equine nutrition and physiology?
So I guess I was that typical young girl that rode horses and just was absolutely fascinated with them and knew I wanted to work with them forever and ever. So as most would imagine, I wanted to be a veterinarian because I didn't really know there was anything else. That landed me at Colorado State University. I'm actually a Wisconsin native. So reading all of these little, equus journals and things like that when I was a kid, a lot of the research was cited at Colorado State. So I landed there. They have a fantastic vet program, as many do know. They're very worldly, I guess, in what they do. But I quickly realized, I want to say within the first 6 months of being there, that, that just wasn't where my passion lied. But when I did quickly figure out that nutrition was for me was in my first class. It was called Feeds and Feeding, which is like even prior to nutrition. It was just like, here's a pig, here's what you feed it. Here's a cow, here's what you feed it. And my faculty, my professor there was Dr. Nancy Earlbeck, and, love her to death. She inspired me so much with her passion in nutrition. She is a comparative nutritionist and just loved feeding animals and cared so much about their nutrition. I was completely inspired and just said, this is amazing. I want to do this, and I want to do it with horses. So kind of throughout my undergrad career, worked with both her and Dr. Paul Siciliano, who's now at North Carolina State, to kind of figure out my next step and my path to graduate school and then to be an educator in equine nutrition. So kind of not to talk too long about it, but that ended me up at Virginia Tech. I did both a master's and a Ph.D. there, looking at both nutrition of the broodmare and lactating mare for my master's, and then moving on to endurance horses and looking at antioxidants and oxidative stress. And that's kind of where that all started. So I'm thrilled to have had that experience at Colorado State. That showed me and opened my eyes to other avenues of, caring for our horses other than the typical vet route.
I think that's how a lot of us start too, right? When you're younger and you love animals, you just assume that, the only career you can really have is being a vet. And then like you get into university, or at least that's what happened to me. And something clicks where you go like, oh, I actually really like this. And I think I want to just dedicate the rest of my life to doing that. And having good mentors along the way is so important too.
Tired of navigating the pet food industry alone? The Pet Food Inner Circle brings together the brightest minds in pet nutrition, where seasoned professionals share real insights and tackle the challenges that matter most. When you need answers, industry leaders are just a conversation away. Ready to join the circle? Visit petfoodinnercircle.com and connect with your peers today.
Perfect. So one of the first things we're going to talk about, and you mentioned it sort of in the work that you've done as well, with your work with pasture management and grazing horses. And it's something that a lot of our guests have talked a lot about on this podcast, which is the foundation of forage in our horses' diet. So I think that's something that, we know as nutritionists, vets know, and I think horse owners are becoming more aware of as well. At least I hope so. So what do you recommend to horse owners who are looking to feed an all or mostly forage diet to their horses? What are some considerations?
Yeah, absolutely. And good for them. Good for you. If you're one of those that want to feed that all forage diet, it can be done. I evented my horse up through prelim. She was a thoroughbred on pretty much all forage. But what I do caution owners is not all forage is equal. And we do need to make sure that that it's not just fed by weight, because there's a lot of other nutrients in the forage that we also need to check, namely some of the minerals. So we, especially things like copper and zinc, which sometimes, and at least in this part of the country and what I've seen in the Northeast, is typically our copper and zinc is a little low or even borderline deficient, if not more deficient, if you're also trying to exercise these animals on the all forage diet. So particularly if you're using this as a majority of your horse's diet, it's a really good idea and such a huge investment to get a forage sample and get it tested. We have a lot of labs in the U.S. that'll do that. I'm not going to recommend any of them, but an easy Google search or reach out to your extension specialist. They'll be able to pinpoint a lab that can help. But that way you'll really be able to see what of the micronutrients are in there. Yeah, your horse might look healthy, but underlying there might be just a few things that are out of balance in terms of some of the minerals that might be good. And you can do a forage test with your pasture, with your hay, with any of this. And if you do find that there is a slight imbalance, that's when I love to direct people to balancer pellets or ration balancers. I want to say it was maybe 10 years ago, I used to say they are the industry's best kept secret because no one understood what they were. I feel like that's not the case anymore. A lot of people do start to value ration balancers because they're really meant to be fed at a very low level. So very little calories come from it. So if you have the classic, fat pony that doesn't need much, it's giving them the balanced minerals and vitamins and some even balanced with more protein in it, to balance a grass hay diet. So I think, these would be good to add to the diet if you've tested your forage and you find out there's a few imbalances in there.
Mm-hmm. I love that you mentioned testing the forage because I think that's something, I'm sure it's happened to you, where someone will ask you to look at their horse's diet or ask you your opinion. And you're like, well, what are you feeding? They're like, well, hay. And you're like, okay, what kind of, can you give me anything else? And having those discussions about analyzing your hay, I don't think people realize how easy it is to send that hay sample off and get those results back.
And it's not all that expensive. When you think you're buying say you're getting a balancer pellet anyway, just because you think it's what you need to do, that's 50 pounds or 50-pound bag or even 40-pound bag, sometimes up to $50. I'm being very general and your part of the country might vary. But one forage sample is, could be less than 50. It could be a little more than 50, depending on your package, but that's only once. Mm-hmm. And you might be buying a bag of balancer pellet once a month. Well, if you find that your forage is actually totally complete and you don't need anything else, then save your money,
Yeah,
so it's actually really worth the money to do that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I always recommend getting a forage test. And yeah, pastures might change a little bit in terms of some of their nutrients, but they're not going to change a lot in terms of the mineral balance. They'll change a lot more in terms of the non-structural carbohydrates, but really the protein and the minerals are going to stay a little more stable. So you don't need to keep testing it. kind of the same with the hay. If you have a good hay guy and you just want to stay, with that same hay guy, as long as you know that he's like, okay, well, I have this load and it'll be pretty consistent with that load for the next, whatever couple months, that's great. The problem would be, if you're getting it from different suppliers every couple weeks, then that gets a little harder to test. But I think it would still be worth it.
Absolutely. And we know how expensive horses are, right? So if you can save a little bit of money by, maybe not buying the ration balance you were buying previously, or not maybe switching to a cheaper one if you can, then that's definitely something worth considering. And I think something owners would gladly do. That's great. I love that you also mentioned your own horse that you were eventing and that you were able to maintain her on an all-forage diet. Can you talk about that a bit more and talk about some of these horses that are performing at a high level and exercising at a high level, and how we can support those increased demands, especially if someone is trying to do it with forage?
Yeah, so it was actually kind of funny. I had her and was eventing kind of at the prime of her career, probably good, 15, 20 years ago. That's when I first started at Rutgers. And I would always get the question as I was giving all these talks in extension, so what do you feed your horse? And it was kind of embarrassing because I was like, well, she's a thoroughbred, but she's a very easy keeper. So training and doing everything we were doing, she maintained a really, 5 to even 6 body condition score on pasture. She had great pasture and was turned out 24/7. I did use a balancer pellet to make sure, and I had just a few very minor mineral imbalances, but she was competing at a high enough level that I felt like the balancer pellet was warranted. But the other thing I also want to say, if you do have one of these horses and you're lucky enough to have one of these horses that is a pretty easy keeper, even though they are at a fairly high performance level, the one supplement that I will say would be critical, regardless of what they're doing, would be an electrolyte supplement, because horses do lose electrolytes when they're sweating. So anytime you're exercising enough that they're sweating, they should have an electrolyte. That doesn't necessarily mean they need it every day. And even horses in the summer don't need it every day. But you can kind of track your horse's sweat pattern, I guess, for lack of better terms. And if they are sweating when they're, conditioning, they might have one day off, but when they're conditioning fairly routinely, they should be on an electrolyte. And not all electrolytes are made equal. You need to find one that has salt or sodium chloride at the first ingredient. So basically that rules out Gatorade. I have a lot of people ask me, can I just give them Gatorade because they love it? I'm like, yeah, they love it because glucose or sucrose or some sort of sugar is the first ingredient. And that is too diluted for our horses. They have a very concentrated sweat with a lot of concentrated electrolytes. So they really need something formulated for them that has salt as that first ingredient. So I think that's probably my number one thing. The next thing I would recommend is that, if your horse doesn't have good pasture forage access, so like green forage, and they're more on a hay diet, you might also want to look to some antioxidants. And, maybe I'm sneaking ahead a little bit too much to my research, but really it's super important. Dried hay does not have the mineral levels that our high performance horses need. When you dry something in the sun, it denatures the vitamins. So anytime you were to go into a GNC or any, pharmacy and look for a vitamin, they're going to be opaque or dark colored bottles, right? They're not transparent. And that's because any UV light is going to denature the vitamins. So therefore, most of our dried hays are pretty deficient in vitamins. So, if you were even competing or had, an area where you don't have good access to pasture, a good antioxidant supplement would be necessary as well, especially for those that are doing a lot of traveling, a lot of transport. That does add to the stress that they're under.
Well, I love that you brought up the antioxidants and the vitamin E, because you made my job a lot easier trying to transfer over to that topic now. So that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today, in that you've done a lot of research looking at vitamin E and exercising horses and that relationship with oxidative stress. And I think that's really unique, because I do think owners maybe have a basic understanding of sort of that topic and maybe understand sort of some of the roles of vitamin E, but not really. So I thought this was a really great opportunity to sort of have you here and ask you these questions. So before we get too in depth, would you mind explaining what oxidative stress is just to begin with and why we even care about it?
Yeah, great to kind of stop me from steamrolling ahead and to take a step backward.
That's my job.
It is a topic that, it at one time, and it kind of goes in waves, whether it's, in the forefront of media for, human health and even animal health or not. But really oxidative stress is it's a condition that means that the antioxidant status in the body, so all of our antioxidants, vitamin E is the most common, so we'll just keep referring to that. We have these free radicals and these reactive oxygen species, so things like the hydroxyl radicals, hydrogen peroxide, even a superoxide radical, they're all formed during our process of breathing. Basically, we're inhaling oxygen, and during this process of it being converted to water and carbon dioxide, there is a few little spin-offs where we get these reactive oxygen species. So any time where we have either a higher oxygen consumption in the body, we're starting to have more and more of these reactive oxygen species and free radicals developed. Well, we typically, like as you and I are sitting here and we're not exercising and, we're breathing normally, our antioxidants in our normal diet are sufficient enough to take care and to scavenge these free radicals so that they don't go off and harm our cells. So, and what I mean by harm our cells is they can tend to break down that lipid bilayer of our cells and basically destroy the cell membrane, so therefore destroying cells, our immune cells, nervous cells, muscle cells, things like that. So it's not just with oxygen consumption, but also during times of stress. So if you can think, and granted, stress goes all over the place depending on your horse. Some just go in a stall and they're stressed, versus, some need to be on long distance hauls or reproduction. Reproduction is actually really hard on the animal system, as well as things like various environmental toxins, even just illnesses. The list can go on forever in terms of what might potentially stress your horse. So during any of these times, especially if they don't have a good balance of vitamins in their diet, you might want to add something extra to kind of ramp up the antioxidant status to help during times when these reactive oxygen species might be a little higher in the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, have those antioxidants come in as sort of like a cleanup crew is how I think of it.
Exactly.
So you already sort of mentioned stress and sort of introduced that. So I'm going to bring up exercise. So how does exercise impact oxidative stress in our horses and their antioxidant levels?
So I mentioned a little bit already about our increase in oxygen. So, we breathe heavier. I know I can't, run to my car across campus without breathing heavy. So it's the same with our horses. The more they exercise, the more they breathe. So the more oxygen coming into the system, therefore, the more of these reactive oxygen spinoffs we get. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it is typically our exercising horses are also competing. So we got the psychological stress of competition. We also have transport stress. That is a really scary time for a lot of horses to be in a metal box, a lot of weird sounds, a lot of weird smells, and now they're also being removed from their social herd. Their diet might be different, so there's a lot of different things going on that are leading to the stress of that animal and contributing to the oxidative stress. So, and you might think, I'm just trail riding off of the property, and it's not very heavily exercised, so I don't really think my horse has oxidative stress. And it might not, depending on your horse, but just the fact of taking them out of the field, removing them from their herd, and going somewhere that they may or may not be familiar with is one of the potential stressors.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that we always realize all the novel things that we're exposing them to when we take them off property, because to your point, right, they smell things and, sense things in a different way than we do. So, and yeah, they might not know what's going on. Can't always explain that to them. So I know some of the research that you've done as well also looked at the role of age, and I believe training as well on oxidative stress and exercise. Could you speak to that a little bit? How do those factors play a role?
Yeah, so this kind of related to some studies I looked at with human exercise and human, status during training. And there is a huge body of work with humans relating their oxidative and antioxidant status with age. And as humans get older, they typically have higher levels of oxidative stress. So I wanted to see if this was necessarily the case with our horses. So I did, a couple different things and a couple different studies, but really the big study was done by my graduate student, Danielle Smarsh, who's now Dr. Smarsh at Penn State. And we looked at both young horses, and these were yearlings, literally yearlings that have not done anything, pulled out of a field. They were standardbred yearlings. We halter broke them. We trained them for a treadmill and an exerciser, and we wanted to see how does their antioxidant status and oxidative stress levels compare to our older standardbred mares that had been there a while, were exercised, were treadmill trained. We're talking, late teens, teen to, I think 18 years old might have been the oldest one. But how was that in relation to our young yearlings? And I kind of thought just the stress of being in this new atmosphere in this new area was going to actually contribute to some of their stress, along with the fact that they're now
Absolutely.
exercising.
Yeah.
And this is about the time when most race horses are going to start their training anyway, because, we're racing them at 2. So a lot of them were kind of that yearling to long yearling year. But what we found was kind of fascinating with our, not just the young horses, but also the old horses, is that our young horses, and really youth is on everybody's side, because youth was on their side. They really had very low levels of oxidative stress. We almost couldn't stimulate them to have oxidative stress, even though a lot of this exercise was fairly novel. I'm not going to say we started testing them the minute we threw them on the treadmill. We did make sure we had an adaptation period for them. But really their condition, we took even muscle samples because I figured, they're developing, they're growing, there's so much metabolism going on in their bodies alone with their, between their blood and their cardiovascular system and their muscles. But really they had very low levels of, oxidative stress. And they maintained fairly high levels of antioxidant status. Now, they weren't on pasture. We just fed them hay and a basal diet to maintain their nutrient requirements, so any NRC nutrient requirements. The older horses, on the other hand, the ones that weren't, we had a non-exercise and an exercise cohort for both age groups. The exercising mares were very similar to both of the youth groups, the non and exercise youth groups, but the non-exercised mares were the ones that had the high oxidative stress and the lower antioxidant status. So this really, to me, was fascinating because it really shows how important, even as we get older, how important exercise is. Because even though they had exercised in the past, they weren't currently being trained and they weren't currently being exercised, and that really affected the oxidative stress that they were under. We were gonna take this another step and look at dietary interventions with the young horses and training, but it was apparent that they actually didn't need it. They just needed a good basal diet. We needed to make sure that they were on a balanced diet, meaning all of their nutrients were satisfied. We didn't make them deficient in anything to see if that was an effect. But we were really kind of thinking, and our hypothesis was that they were going to need dietary intervention because they were going to have higher levels of oxidative stress, but they didn't. It really, our take-home message was, you need to be exercising those older horses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because really those were the ones that were affected more.
That's fascinating. Because then you even think about even some of the recommendations for vitamin E, assuming that there's oxidative stress happening during exercise, you kind of add in that vitamin E in some cases. So now, taking into your research into account, when do you recommend or make that decision that vitamin E needs to be added in further levels into the diet?
Yeah, so I will say these horses were, while they were exercised here at home on a treadmill, it was all very familiar environment to them. Even though they were young horses, they had still been there a month. They had the month of adaptation. It was still all a very
familiar,
stress-free as an environment as we could manage, other than just the exercise. I will say, if you take it to our horses that are competing, traveling, moving. A lot of other things are being impacted. Along with no pasture, I would say that would be one time where I would look into a vitamin E supplement. And those that might not be on a very high fortified, commercial diet. So if I were to have taken my mare, taken her off pasture, put her on a hay diet with just a balancer, I probably would have wanted to add more vitamin E, because I know her vitamin E was adequate with the pasture, but it probably wouldn't have been with the hay. I will also say, and now I have another horse, and he's the one, I think he's, right there behind me. He's that 7-year-old that I am now, kind of bringing up in his training, and he's part warm blood, so he's a little bit further behind than a lot of our thoroughbreds. But he started to have some weird issues that we ended up diagnosing him with Lyme. And very low levels of vitamin E at the same time. So while we were treating him for Lyme, we also started treating him with some water-soluble vitamin E to try to get his vitamin E levels up, because we thought that might have led to some of the, and I don't want to use the big neurologic word, but there was starting to be some concerns there. And I know some horses, and this is a big thing, and there's a lot of research being done out at UC Davis right now, University of California, Davis, with looking at horses that might be genetically predisposed to have problems with metabolizing vitamin E. And I will say he might be one of them, because we've been continuing to test him even on high levels of vitamin E, and he maintains a very, very low status regardless of that. So, I know vitamin E testing has been big lately, and if you do have one of these horses, I would continue to supplement them with vitamin E, especially if they are exercising and traveling.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I have a young Hanoverian mare, and it was a similar situation. Like, she was just kind of being funny in her development and like proprioception. And so I had the vet out, we did all these tests, and she was like, oh, test her vitamin E. And I was like, she's literally on pasture. I'm giving her additional vitamin E, like on paper, like she's getting way more than she needs. I was like, I really don't think it's that. And then sure enough, we tested her in exact same situation. She came up low. And we've just had to maintain her on like a more absorbable form of vitamin E, which we're going to get into. But I'm glad that and then I did the same thing. I'm like looking up all this research, being like, what is going on? And sure enough, there does seem to be this cohort of horses that just isn't metabolizing and absorbing vitamin E the way the others do.
Yeah, and I will say, and this is kind of my caveat too, I've been out of the vitamin E realm for quite a while now. So I know there's a lot of researchers out there that are starting to do a lot more with vitamin E. And I will say I am really excited about the work that's coming out. And, hopefully they will figure out, like, is there this genetic line or what's going on? Or is there some sort of cure that we can do to help some of these horses out? Because I'm starting to hear this more and more and more. And I get contacted a lot just because I do have a lot of publications, for my previous work with vitamin E.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like my vet had mentioned it. She was like, oh, I think we should do that, because I've seen quite a few of these young warm bloods with this situation. I'm like, okay, weird. But you had sort of mentioned a little bit the form of vitamin E that you were supplying or supplementing to your horse. Could you talk about that a bit more, and how these different formats and the way that we provide vitamin E to the horses can impact their overall level of absorption and their circulating levels?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I will go back to my studies as a graduate student. I use the typical synthetic form of vitamin E that you can get pretty much anywhere and a little more cheaply, I guess. So it was DL-alpha tocopherol. So that's what I started working with and found a lot of great benefits with that. So I'm not going to say it's not for your horse or it's not for everybody. You can still get some decent results. But then we start getting into the more natural forms and the water soluble forms and things like that, which are more readily available and more absorbable for pretty much for all horses, but particularly for some of these horses that might have this deficiency within their metabolic process that requires it to have a little bit more bioavailable form. So it skips a few steps in the vitamin E metabolism process when you go straight to this water soluble or the natural form, which is usually D-alpha tocopherol, or you might see all racemic. There's a couple different ways, but typically if your supplement's going to have a natural form, it's going to say in big letters or something on the front, natural vitamin E, because that's definitely a big, a big selling factor for a lot of them. In my experience, you'll see the price tag go up, but you'll also probably not need to feed quite as much. A lot of the studies that I looked at fed 5,000 IU of this DL or the synthetic vitamin E. In some instances, you might need to, be able to bump down to, 2,000 or 2,500 IU instead, because the rate of absorption is about, and, it's roughly double for the water soluble forms. But what I do say is if you have one of these horses that either has some condition, whether it's, tying up or like the Lyme or something, equine motor neuron disease, some of these kind of vitamin E deficient sort of diseases, I would skip the synthetics and go with the natural forms, because that will definitely ensure that your horse can uptake the amount that it needs.
That's great. I think to your point, I don't know that owners maybe always realize why there's a price difference, right, with some of these different supplements. If they're looking at vitamin E over here and, this one next to it and one's double the cost, they might just go for the cheaper one, not realizing. So I think that's always an important conversation to have with everyone who's buying supplements. So no, that's great. I think that it was just a great conversation, and I'm very interested in vitamin E because of my mare and everything that I had happen there. I kind of went on a bit of a deep dive, as we do, right, when we get handed these unique situations and these unique horses who just throw us off our game a little bit. So thank you so much for the great discussion and for taking the time to share all this incredible research you've done and all of the incredible knowledge that you've obtained over the years. Before we wrap up, I will ask you a few more questions that we can leave our audience with. If there was one key thing that you wish more horse owners understood about feeding horses, what would it be?
There's a lot, but I think the one that plagues me the most is that we need to remember our horses are not humans. Because there is so many diet fads out there that I feel are fueled by human nutrition. And while we might be able to take some parts and pieces from our own lives, it's not true for many of them. So, I think one good example is, feeding our horses, or whatever. There's so many. I'm trying to figure out just one of them. But, a whole grain or all natural diet.
Gluten-free.
There you go. Processed.
Gluten-free is one that drives me crazy.
Yeah. So, there is a limit with processing, but, in the horse world, there are some things that have to be processed. Barley is a great grain for horses. So, and it is used quite readily, but you can't feed it whole. It needs to be processed because the hull around it is so hard, it will never get all the nutrients out unless it's at least like crushed, crimped, something along those lines. Kind of the same with getting our horses their, some of the vitamin and mineral supplements. You're not going to be able to feed them the pure forms to a lot of horses because they're just not going to like the flavor, or the powder is going to sift to the bottom, or there's just going to be things that they're not going to eat it. So we need to pellet it. We have to put it in a pellet, and that's a form of processing. Some people love rice bran, wheat bran, all of these bran or meal sort of products that come from whole grains, but the grain has been processed to get to that point. So really feeding them, and another thing, flaxseed, and there's a whole nother topic is about
we'll talk about flaxseed.
Everybody loves flaxseed, but everybody likes to have it processed. Granted, it doesn't have to be, but there are just some things. So there's a limit on the processing, and I wouldn't really be afraid of it with feeding our horses because it's not all that bad when we look at some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. They have benefits, and there's reasons why we do it. So I
Yeah, the whole like no carb thing too, which I think has kind of subsided, but that was a really big one maybe, 8-10 years ago. I've recently not found that people are going no carb, because I heard everybody used to say no carb. Well, I just want to be clear that fiber is a carbohydrate and there's a lot of fiber in our hay. And, yes, I'm okay with the, controlled starch or some of the low sugar feeding, because some horses really do need that. But I do want to be clear, not all horses need low sugar. Some of these really high level eventers or, jumpers, race horses, things like that, their fuel comes from a lot of these non-structural carbohydrates. So they will need more of the sugars and the starches in their diet. So it's not for everybody. And really, I guess, going back to the beginning of our conversation with forage first, I think should be, on everybody's mind, regardless of what horse they have.
It's time for our famous three.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, back to your conversation, forage is basically all carbs, right? So you can't really have one and not the other. You might have already sort of mentioned this in your answer, but the next question I was going to ask you was, what's one equine nutrition myth you'd like to see disappear?
So yeah, I kind of saved this one. That protein is the root of all evil.
Oh.
And AKA also alfalfa. So, really both, there's some horses that really need higher levels of protein and they really need alfalfa. Some of these are our young growing horses.
Mm-hmm.
My young warm blood as a 3-year-old, he needed to be on, added alfalfa cubes along with his grass hay diet. Because he was still growing. And really, 10 to 12% protein is kind of the standard, which we feed a lot of our exercising horses. But when they're at this stage, they need 14, 16, and they need the fortified lysine, threonine sort of diets. Some of our older horses, as long as they have, good healthy kidneys, also do well on a little higher protein, because it helps them with, maintain their top line and, maintain their muscle condition as well. Alfalfa really actually has low starch compared to a lot of other grains. So feeding even some of our performing horses and performance horses that have sugar issues, that might have insulin resistance. I've done a lot of consults for some, dressage horses that are insulin resistant, but oh man, they still need high energy. So, feeding them alfalfa is a really good idea, because it has the controlled or the lower levels of starch that they might need, but also still high in energy and protein and everything else. So
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Because as a nutritionist, I find, I love putting alfalfa in diets, right? Like you get your protein, you get your energy, but I don't know.
Horses love it.
They love it. Absolutely. But I don't know, to your point, where this fear of alfalfa stems from, because it does seem to be widespread and it's not always for the same reasons.
Yeah, I've heard, risk of laminitis. I've heard, diarrhea, and my horse goes crazy. And, if you do introduce it wrong or feed it to the wrong horse, these things could happen. Don't go home tomorrow and throw your horse, 2 flakes of alfalfa in the evening because you heard on the podcast that it was good. You want to do a slow introduction, because otherwise your horse might get diarrhea from it. Some of these horses that are, prone to obesity might not need a lot of it.
Absolutely.
If you have an extremely insulin resistant laminitic pony, maybe this isn't the right step, the right thing you need. But I think it's poor management of the use of alfalfa is what has led to a lot of these misconceptions.
Yeah, you're probably right. But I don't know. I don't know how we put that one to bed. We'll have to.
I'm trying.
You'll have to come back and give us an update on how that journey is going.
Yeah, right.
And the very last question I have for you that I ask everyone: if you could own any horse, real or fictional, past or present, who would it be and why?
Okay, so coming from the eventer side of me, I've got 3. And I've got 3 from all the 3 phases. So, I remember being a kid, I always had a poster of Gem Twist on the wall as, the elite show jumper back in the 90s, just an amazing horse, amazing caliber, so that would probably be one from the show jumping side. But You have to look at Vallegro and just how amazing of a dressage horse he was, and just how everybody was in awe every time he even set foot in an arena. But yet, coming from the little, the sport horse world and loving the eventing side, Theodore Roosevelt, that little eventing pony of Karen Davidson's, just looked like so much fun to ride, and just an amazing athlete that he could keep up with all of those big warm bloods and yet be 14 whatever plus hand pony. I've always thought that he would be really super cool to have around as well.
That's great. I love that you had one for each distance. That's perfect. I'm going to have to make everyone else who comes up after you raise the bar a little bit and have to match your answer. Well, perfect. This has been fantastic. I've personally really enjoyed listening to you and being a part of this conversation, and I'm sure that our listeners will as well. So I can't thank you enough for joining us today.
Awesome. No problem. Thank you for the invite, and thank you everybody for watching and listening.
Perfect. Yeah, we might have to have you back on again. Maybe we'll talk about alfalfa next time.
Would be happy to.
Perfect. To everyone tuning in, thank you for listening to another episode of the Pet Food Science Podcast. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to subscribe for more conversations on both equine and pet nutrition. And Dr. Williams, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you.